Amelia stood at the door, her heart pounding as she opened it. The soft glow of the setting sun bathed the porch in warm light, but despite the beauty of the moment, she felt an inexplicable sense of dread. Before her stood Henry, her husband Ethan's father. He had always been a figure of respect and distance, a man absorbed in his work who rarely visited. Yet here he was standing on their doorstep with a suitcase in hand. "Amelia, it's good to see you," Henry said, his voice as calm and steady as ever. "Henry, what a surprise," Amelia replied, forcing a smile. "We weren't expecting you." Henry stepped inside, and the house seemed to shrink around his presence. Ethan was still at work, and their 2 children were at school, leaving her alone with this man who had always felt like a stranger despite their familial ties. They exchanged pleasantries, but the conversation felt strained. Amelia couldn't shake the feeling that something was different about Henry. He was polite, as always, but there was a subtle intensity in his gaze that made her uneasy. They moved to the living room, where Amelia offered him a cup of tea. As she poured, her hands trembled slightly, and she noticed how Henry's eyes followed her every movement. She tried to dismiss it as her imagination, but the feeling of being watched persisted. "How's everything with you and Ethan?" Henry asked, his tone casual but his gaze sharp. Amelia hesitated. "We're fine, just busy with the kids and work." Henry nodded, but the look in his eyes told her he wasn't convinced. "It must be a lot to juggle." "It has its moments, but we manage," Amelia replied, her smile not reaching her eyes. The conversation lulled, and an uncomfortable silence filled the room. Amelia could feel the tension between them, like a cord stretched too tight. She couldn't understand why she felt this way around Henry, a man she had always considered distant and aloof. Yet now there was something about him that intrigued her, something that made her want to uncover the mystery behind his calm facade. The unease grew as the evening wore on. Henry's presence in the house was unsettling in a way Amelia couldn't quite articulate. It wasn't that he was unkind or rude. On the contrary, he was polite and considerate, as always. But there was something beneath the surface, something that made her skin prickle with a strange mix of apprehension and anticipation. When Ethan finally returned home, Amelia felt a wave of relief. She hoped that her husband's presence would dispel the tension that had settled over her like a heavy blanket. But as the 3 of them sat down to dinner, she realized that the feeling hadn't dissipated at all. If anything, it had intensified. Ethan chatted about his day, oblivious to the undercurrents swirling around them. Amelia forced herself to focus on his words, but her attention kept drifting back to Henry. Every time. She looked at him. She found his eyes already on her, and each time, her heart skipped a beat. After dinner, Ethan suggested they all retire for the night. Amelia felt a strange sense of disappointment. It was absurd, but she caught herself wanting to stay, to continue feeling the strange attraction that had filled the room. But of course, she couldn't allow herself that. She silently got up and followed her husband, leaving Henry alone with his thoughts. The night was long. Amelia tossed and turned in bed, unable to fall asleep. Her thoughts kept returning to Henry, his gaze, his calmness, and the way he seemed to know something she didn't. She could hear his voice in her head, a voice she somehow couldn't forget. She tried to convince herself that it was all just her imagination, that she was worked up from fatigue and stress, but it didn't help. Inside her, something was stirring, something she was afraid to name aloud. The next morning, Amelia tried to act normally. She and Ethan had breakfast together, discussing plans for the day. But she felt Henry's eyes on her, as if he were trying to decipher her thoughts. It felt like a game where no one had spoken the rules aloud, yet both participants knew it was underway. When Ethan left for work and the children went to school, Amelia was left alone with Henry. The house was quiet, only the wind outside swaying the trees, creating a sense of coziness and tranquility. She tried to focus on household chores, but her thoughts kept drifting back to him. She found herself listening for his footsteps, the sounds he made, and at some point she realized she was waiting for their encounter. He entered the kitchen while she was washing dishes. His presence was so overwhelming that she felt a pang of nervousness in her chest. She didn't dare turn around, but she knew he was standing nearby, and this closeness made her heart race. "Amelia." His voice came unexpectedly, and she flinched. He was as calm as always, but there was a hidden note in his tone that made her catch her breath. She turned around and met his gaze. He was closer than she had expected, and she felt a chill run down her spine. His eyes were full of mystery, as if he knew something she didn't understand. They stared at each other in silence, and in that moment, Amelia realized that something more than just a connection between a father-in-law and a daughter-in-law had developed between them. She wanted to say something, but the words stuck in her throat. They stood so close that she could hear his breathing, and that sensation enveloped her completely. Inside her, a storm was brewing. She understood that something was happening that shouldn't be, but she couldn't stop it. Every glance, every gesture from him drew her in, and she knew it wasn't just attraction. It was something else, something that was kindling slowly, like a fire smoldering gradually. Henry turned away first, as if giving her a chance to collect her thoughts. But she knew that this moment would linger in her memory for a long time. She continued with her tasks, but every moment of that day was permeated by his presence, his gazes, his voice. It was like a premonition of a storm that had yet to start, but had already captured all her attention. That day passed, leaving Amelia with the feeling that something in her life had changed. She realized that what was happening was dangerous, but she couldn't resist it. Everything seemed so mundane, yet inside her an elusive force was growing, gradually taking over her entirely. All day, she tried to find an explanation for her feelings: cleaning, cooking, household chores. All of it was supposed to distract her. But every time she was alone, her thoughts returned to Henry. She was agitated, but she didn't understand why. It felt as though an invisible net was forming around her, tightening its grip with each passing day. When evening came and Ethan returned from work, she tried to act as usual. They had dinner together, discussing everyday matters. Ethan talked about some work issues, and she tried to listen, but her gaze kept falling on Henry, who also seemed to sense the hidden tension between them. His calmness and silence became something mysterious and intriguing, as if he were waiting for her to make the first move. After dinner, Ethan suggested going for a walk, but feeling tired and overwhelmed, Amelia declined. He shrugged, kissed her on the forehead, and left, leaving her alone with Henry. It was a strange moment when the air in the room became heavy, like before a storm. Amelia didn't know what to say and felt a slight shiver overcoming her. "Amelia." Henry broke the silence, his voice calm but with an undertone of insistence that made her flinch. "You've changed somehow. Is everything all right?" This simple question made her tense up. She couldn't admit to him what she was feeling, as she didn't fully understand it herself. But his words, his concern for her state, were unexpected and, worse, desirable. "Yes, everything is fine," she replied, trying to appear as calm as possible. "I'm just a bit tired." Henry didn't say anything, but his gaze lingered on her longer than usual. In his eyes, she saw questions to which she couldn't find answers. They fell back into silence, but this silence didn't feel awkward. Rather, it was filled with hidden tension, as if they were both waiting for something but hesitating to make the first move. At some point, it became unbearable for her to be in the same room with him. She felt her heart start to race and her thoughts became tangled. She got up from the sofa, trying not to look at Henry, and headed toward the door. "I'm going to get some fresh air," she said, not looking back. He didn't reply, and she went outside, feeling the night air envelop her with its coolness. The forest around their house stood quiet and calm, with only a gentle breeze rustling the leaves. She took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing heart, and slowly walked along the path leading deeper into the forest. She needed to think, to understand what was happening to her. This man, her husband's father, a man who had always seemed cold and distant. Why was she now feeling something toward him that she couldn't explain? These thoughts tormented her, but they brought no clarity. She walked further into the forest, trying to sort out her thoughts. The path led her to a small pond whose existence she had almost forgotten. The water was dark and still, reflecting the night sky with its few stars. She sat down on a bench by the water, listening to the wind playing with the branches of the trees. In this solitude, she finally managed to calm down. She closed her eyes and allowed herself to forget about Henry, Ethan, and all her worries for a moment. But the calm was short-lived. At some point, she heard footsteps behind her and tensed. Immediately opening her eyes, she saw a figure approaching. It was Henry. He came closer and sat down next to her on the bench without saying a word. His presence again made her nervous. But at the same time, she felt something new igniting within her, a spark that she couldn't extinguish. They sat in silence, side by side. The silence around them was complete. But in that silence, Amelia felt an invisible force flowing between them. It was like an electric current running across her skin, making her heart beat faster. Inside her, two feelings struggled: an urge to leave and a fear of what might happen if she stayed. Henry slowly turned his head and looked at her. In his eyes, she saw the same thing she felt herself: attraction, passion that he was hiding but had become too strong to ignore. He didn't say a word, but that look spoke more than any words could. Amelia couldn't look away, couldn't leave. They were like two magnets drawn to each other despite all obstacles. She felt her breathing quicken, and she was afraid he would hear how fast her heart was beating. At that moment, she felt frightened that she could no longer control herself, that the attraction to this man had become too strong. She knew that if she stayed here any longer, she wouldn't be able to resist anymore. But Henry, sensing her anxiety, broke the connection first. He turned his gaze and looked at the dark surface of the pond. Amelia felt the tension between them begin to dissipate, but along with it came disappointment. She wanted him to make the first move, for the spark they both felt to ignite, but he might have understood that it was too dangerous. "It's very peaceful here," he finally said, his voice calm and even again, as if nothing had happened. "Yes," she nodded, trying to regain control. "It's a good place to think." He looked at her again, and she realized that this moment was just the beginning of something more. Despite everything she felt, despite all the danger, she knew that this evening was only the first spark in the flame that would inevitably ignite. They stayed there for a while longer until the night air began to chill them. Finally, Amelia got up, and Henry did the same. They walked back to the house in silence where their old lives awaited them. But she knew that this night had changed everything. When they returned, Ethan was already asleep. Amelia climbed into bed, feeling the cold night air from the forest still tickling her skin. She closed her eyes, but sleep did not come. She lay there listening to Ethan's quiet breathing and thought about how everything would soon change. This night had marked the beginning of something new, something dangerous. But she could not avoid it. Her life would never be the same, and she could no longer stop what had begun. The next morning, Amelia woke up with the feeling that the night in the forest was not a dream, but a reality that was gradually taking over her life. Everything around her seemed strangely familiar, but also changed. She couldn't get rid of thoughts about Henry, about how they had sat by the pond, surrounded by silence and hidden passion. His image haunted her, even as she tried to focus on ordinary tasks. Ethan had left for work early in the morning, and once again, she was alone in the house with Henry. The day began as usual. The kids went off to school, and she took care of the cleaning. But everything around seemed painted in new, more vivid colors. In every step Henry took around the house, in every glance he cast, she felt something she had never noticed before. It was like an electric charge in the air that couldn't be ignored. All day she tried to avoid encountering him. She felt that if they were alone again, what had happened by the pond would repeat itself, and she wouldn't be able to resist any longer. Yet she still heard his footsteps in the neighboring rooms, and that feeling continued to envelop her like a suffocating fog. As evening approached with the sun already setting, she heard his voice calling her from the living room. It was calm, as if nothing had happened, but she felt it was merely a facade concealing something much deeper. She entered the room trying to appear confident, but inside, she was trembling. Henry stood by the window, looking out at the golden evening sky. She noticed him slightly turn his head toward her, catching the sound of her approaching steps. "Amelia," he said quietly, as if testing her reaction to the sound of his voice. "Yes?" she responded, trying to keep her voice steady, though she knew it was becoming increasingly difficult. He didn't answer right away, and she moved closer, unable to resist the unknown attraction. The room was filled with silence, and only the faint wind outside reminded them that the world beyond their home continued to move. She found herself next to him, closer than she had intended, and felt the air between them growing dense and palpable. Henry slowly turned to face her, and his eyes met hers. At that moment, Amelia realized that she could no longer run away. A fire was igniting between them that couldn't be extinguished. His gaze was so intense that she felt a shiver run through her body. "Why are you avoiding me?" he asked softly, as if knowing the answer but wanting to hear it from her. Amelia took a deep breath, trying to gather her thoughts, but they scattered like sand through her fingers. She couldn't lie to him, couldn't pretend that everything was fine. "Because I'm afraid," she admitted, feeling her throat dry up. Henry nodded slowly, as if understanding what she meant. He took a step toward her, and she felt his hand touch hers. The touch was light, almost weightless, but it stirred a storm of emotions within her. She looked up, meeting his gaze, and realized that she could no longer resist. Henry moved closer, his breath brushing against her skin, and she couldn't look away. At that moment, there was only a thin line between them that was about to disappear. She didn't know how it would all end, but she knew one thing. She wanted it. She wanted him. He lifted his hand and gently caressed her cheek. The motion was so tender that she felt goosebumps running across her skin. Her heart pounded so hard that she was afraid he might hear it. She couldn't hold back this feeling any longer. It had engulfed her completely. Henry leaned in closer, and time seemed to stop. She saw his eyes darken with passion as his lips slowly approached hers. She knew she should step back, stop this, but instead, she took a step forward, feeling his hand tighten around her face. Finally, his lips touched hers. It was more than just a kiss. It was a release from all the constraints, all the rules and prohibitions. His lips were soft and warm, and this kiss evoked such strong feelings in her that she had never experienced before. Everything inside her screamed that this was wrong, that she was making a huge mistake, but at that moment, she couldn't stop. Henry pulled her closer, and she felt his arms wrapping around her, as if trying to keep her from falling into the abyss she had thrown herself into. The kiss was long and deep, full of the passion that had been hidden in both of them for so long. She responded with the same intensity with which he was kissing her, and she felt his hands moving across her body, stirring a wave of desire within her. She knew it was wrong. She knew this moment would change everything. But at that moment, she couldn't think of anything else but how much she wanted this man who stood before her. When they finally broke apart, both of them breathing heavily, Amelia couldn't believe what had just happened. Her lips still burned from his kiss, and her heart raced as if she had run a marathon. They looked at each other, trying to grasp what they had just done. "Amelia," Henry whispered, his voice filled with an uncertainty she had never heard before. "We shouldn't..." But she didn't let him finish. She knew he was right, but she couldn't let this moment end like this. She pulled him to her again, and their lips met once more, this time with even greater passion. This kiss was longer, hotter, and she felt his arms embracing her again, leaving her no chance to escape. They couldn't stop, even if they wanted to. This moment was what they had both been waiting for, but had been afraid to admit to themselves. She knew this kiss would change everything, but she couldn't stop. She wanted him more than ever. Finally, when they pulled away from each other, Amelia felt the world collapse around them. She realized that their lives would never be the same. This kiss had become a point of no return, and she didn't know where it would lead them, but she was sure of one thing: they could no longer go back. Henry slowly released her, his eyes still filled with passion, but also showing concern. She felt the tension between them, which could no longer be ignored. They both understood that they had made a huge mistake, but that knowledge couldn't stop what had begun. "We need to think," he said, and she nodded, not knowing what to say in response. They stood there in that room, filled with silence and tension, and Amelia knew that this moment had changed everything. The next morning, Amelia woke with a heavy burden on her shoulders. Everything that had happened in the last few days, every tense moment with Henry, the kisses, and the inevitable conversations, had become so real and palpable that she could no longer ignore her feelings. Ethan had left for work early again, leaving Henry and her alone in the house. The sensation of his proximity, the knowledge that they were alone, and what had happened between them,